Welcome to ASU Help Center's Certified Trainer Module 9 Testing. In this training session, we will discuss the use and purpose of testing in the training environment. We will show how to assess learning performance, explain how to provide effective feedback, and explain how to develop questions for testing and to utilize during your lessons for your lesson plans. Evaluating performance should not be an afterthought. It takes preparation. First, you need to identify what participants need to perform well in their job. Then you want to match session learning objectives with the job requirements. Then, assess performance during and after training. During and upon completion of training, test participants' knowledge and retention. Develop and apply one or more of the assessment tools we will be discussing. Finally, evaluate training after a period of time, such as at 30 days, to determine retention of knowledge and gaps in the training and to provide refresher training when necessary. Feedback can be difficult, but when used the right way, it can be one of the most effective ways to improve learning. There are 6 main rules of providing constructive feedback. These include: don't go overboard. Don't provide too much praise because it leads to demotivating situations. Correct behavior quietly. Public attack undermines learning. Be specific. Let participants know what was good, remove any ambiguity, and let them know what you want them to do. Focus on process, not on natural ability. Combine open and close-ended questions. Finally, end with clear action points. Any feedback that does not lead to a change in behavior is ineffective. We use tests in training to determine whether or not students have sufficient knowledge or skills to meet the requirements established by learning objectives for that lesson. That is, whether or not the student has learned the material and/or can meet a minimum standard for the skill being taught. The philosophy underlying testing is based on the achievement of lesson learning objectives. Tests are given to determine if a student can demonstrate in some measurable way achievement of the objectives. You will fill a critical role in the testing for the courses that you instruct. After the curriculum has been validated, instructors are responsible for the maintenance of tests, for test questions, and for the development of additional test items and analysis of tests and test items. You will be concerned with 2 methods of testing: knowledge and performance. Knowledge tests measure achievement of objectives through the use of test items written at the appropriate learning level. Performance tests measure skill acquisition by having the student demonstrate specific behaviors defined by the learning objectives. Testing in the learning environment is principally verbal, but the ideas discussed can also be applied to written questions for written testing. The behavior, conditions, and standards specified in the objectives will determine the level of learning tested. You need to know how students will use this material on the job so that you can test the material to that level. We use 5 levels of learning to test knowledge: recognition, recall, comprehension, application, and analysis. Let's examine each of these in a little bit more detail. Recognition is a process of verbatim identification of specific terms, facts, rules, methods, principles, procedures, objects, and the like, presented during the training. Students select from 2 or more choices to identify the information. Recall is a verbatim remembering of specific items, facts, rules, methods, procedures, principles, and the like. To correctly answer a recall test item, students remember and respond exactly as taught. A recall test item requires students to respond from memory instead of selecting the responses from 2 or more choices. Listing the steps in a call procedure and answering a completion question by labeling the steps are an example of a recall test item. Comprehension is understanding what was taught rather than simply memorizing the words. It can be demonstrated by interpreting, explaining, translating, or summarizing information. Comprehension requires students to paraphrase the material presented in the item rather than taking it word for word from the lesson. Asking a student to explain how a computer system works is an example of a comprehension test item. Application involves the ability to use acquired knowledge in a job-related situation. Application questions require students to demonstrate knowledge through mental skill exercises such as answering a mock customer service call. Analysis involves the understanding of the elements of data and relationships among the data that make the measuring of information explicit. Evaluation involves the judgment of the value of the effectiveness of procedures or solutions based on data, criteria, and standards. In developing knowledge test items, focus on the learning level being tested and write the test question to that level. You may use any of the four main types of knowledge test items, such as multiple choice, true or false, matching, or completion. Let's look at each of the four types of knowledge test questions more closely. The multiple choice item is the most frequently used of the four types of test items. They provide a fairly versatile tool. Properly constructed, they can be used to test all levels of knowledge except recall. The multiple choice test items consist of the following: instructions, STEM, choices, and correct answer. Typically, this type of test item contains 2 to 4 choices. However, depending on the nature of the content being tested, you can use more. Make one of the choices the correct answer to the question and all the others plausible choices. The following sections present guidelines for STEM construction, alternative choice construction, test item forms, and formats, along with common errors in item construction. A cardinal rule in test item development is to communicate effectively. Use the following guidelines as a checklist to make sure you properly write multiple choice test item stems. First, include all information, conditions, assumptions, and details required for the student to correctly answer the question without requiring them to refer to the choices. Next, phrase the question positively. If you must use a negative, highlight it in caps or underlined so that the student will notice it and interpret the item correctly. Use clear, unambiguous wording so that only one answer is correct. If there are multiple correct answers, it must be clearly stated that more than one answer may apply. Include words, phrases, and so on that pertain to all choices rather than repeating them in the alternative. Omit information not essential to the interpretation of the question unless the learning objective being tested calls for the student to extract relevant information from a larger body of knowledge. Use complete sentences. Finally, test only one idea or central thought. You must exercise care when designing the alternative choices for multiple choice questions. Make sure the possible answers are plausible and fit well with the STEM. The difficulty of the item will depend largely upon the choices. The more closely related the options are, the more difficult it is for students to select the correct answer. A good rule is to develop choices based on common misconceptions by students. You may prepare choices based on how students may incorrectly manipulate terms, symbols, and so forth. An additional rule is to look at the correct answer and determine how you may make it incorrect. Observe the following requirements in developing multiple choice alternatives. First, include only one correct answer, or if there are multiple correct answers, clearly state more than one answer may apply. Use closely related, that is relevant or plausible, choices. Use choices that are meaningful and not subject to automatic elimination because they are irrelevant or unrelated to the question. Use terms with which the student should be familiar or that you can explain within the limits of the question. Make all choices approximately the same length and of the same complexity. Do not use words such as always or never, unless knowledge of the applicability or inapplicability of the absolute is part of the knowledge being tested. Avoid using negative wording. However, if you must use negative wording, highlight it. For example, put the text in caps or underline it. It is important to standardize how stems and alternatives are written. There are two different acceptable formats, closed stem or open stem. You may create a closed stem item as a complete statement or as an incomplete statement. The complete statement format has the advantage of forcing you to state the problem clearly in the stem. It also reduces the possibility of giving students grammatical clues. A disadvantage is that it may require lengthier responses. When written as an incomplete statement, the completion position appears within the statement, not at the end of the stem. Although this form of test question item is typically easier to write than complete statement stems, use them sparingly. They encourage lifting of test items verbatim from the material and encourage students to memorize answers rather than to apply knowledge. The open stem format uses an open-ended stem, which is an incomplete statement with the response position at the end of the statement. Each choice provides a seemingly logical conclusion to the stem. Although incomplete statement stems are typically easier to write than complete statement stems, they may cause you to avoid thinking about the question before you develop the alternatives. That may result in illogical or unrelated choices. Generally, the less similar choices are in content, the easier it is for students to select the correct choice. You may construct multiple choice test items either as questions or incomplete statements using either the standard or accept format. The standard format is straightforward and the easiest to develop. Use it when you only want students to select the correct answer from the choices provided. Use the accept format when 3 or more equally correct choices answer the question. This format requires students to recognize which choices are correct and select the one that is incorrect. Always capitalize and bold or underline the word accept in the stem. Use the accept format sparingly. There are several common errors that you need to avoid when developing multiple choice questions. Here are 4 examples. First, do not use similar wording in both the stem and only the correct choice. It suggests the correct answer. Next, do not state the correct choices in greater detail than the other choices. This practice often cues the correct answer. Do not use 2 or more choices that have the same meaning. It eliminates them as useful choices and simplifies the correct choice. Finally, do not use choices that are included in other choices. True-false questions are really just 2-response multiple-choice questions. Use them only when one plausible alternative to an item exists. A major drawback to true-false items is that they are more susceptible to guessing. A student who does not know the correct answer has a 50% chance of responding correctly to a true-false item. Use true-false items to test recognition, comprehension, application, and evaluation. Here are some guidelines when creating a true-false question. The true-false item format is straightforward. Write the stem as a direct statement and label the 2 choices below it as either true or false. Observe the following rules for constructing true-false item stems. First, include all relevant information and conditions required for the student to correctly answer the item in the descriptive statement. Make the statement concise and clear. Make sure the proposition that makes the statement true or false is evident. Make sure the statement is clearly true or false. When possible, make a false statement consistent with a typical misconception. Do not use specific determiners, for example, always, never, none, all, may, or sometimes, unless knowledge of the applicability or inapplicability of these absolutes is part of what is being tested. When possible, use positive statements to minimize confusion and reinforce key learning. Finally, do not lift questions verbatim from the lesson plan or curriculum. Matching test items are generally the hardest to construct. Matching test items are defined as two lists of connected words, phrases, pictures, or symbols. Every item in one list is paired with at least one item in the other list. This type of testing is often best done as a group with the items listed on the whiteboard. Students must match elements on one list with associated elements on the other list based on specific instructions. Students pair the elements in each list and record the answer. Matching test items are ideally suited for testing recognition, but if written correctly, may also test comprehension and application. The matching test item format consists of a stem and two columns listed below the stem. The stem provides directions as to how the student must match the item in the two columns. One column contains the question or problems to be answered, and the other column consists of the answers. Use the following guidelines when constructing matching test items. First, always place the question in the left-hand column and place the answer in the right-hand column. When feasible, use single words in the answer list. Make all answers related to the question. This helps to prevent elimination of unrelated answers. Specifying the directions how often students may use the answers. If you avoid a one-to-one correlation between the questions and the answers, it increases the test item's degree of difficulty. When possible, arrange the answers according to some system. For example, numerically, or in some kind of ascending or descending order. Completion test items are free response items in which the student must supply the missing information from memory. You may make completion items into listing test items in which students must list required answers such as system names, procedural steps, and so forth from memory. The advantage of completion items over multiple choice or true-false item tests is that completion tests require more than simple recognition of information. That is, they eliminate the possibility of guessing. Construct completion items using three basic formats. First, students supply the word or phrase that completes the statement. Or, the student provides a definition, term, or similar response to a specific question. Or, the student supplies a list of procedures, steps, and so forth from memory. This type of test item may be expressed in question or statement form. Use the following guidelines when constructing completion test items. First, word the test item clearly and comprehensively enough to allow a student who is knowledgeable in the subject area to correctly answer the question. Make sure the missing segment of the incomplete statement item is important, such as a key element of a process, method, or system. In incomplete statement items, do not omit too many words, or the statement will become unclear and force students to guess. Make sure the response position appears near or at the end of the stem. Items with the response position near the beginning are harder to read and generally take longer to answer. Provide sufficient space on the answer sheet for students to enter their entire response, or give students enough time to answer if you are asking the question orally. Use a direct question to test for comprehension of technical terms or knowledge of definitions. Do not make the correct answer a giveaway word that could be guessed by students who do not really know the information. In addition, avoid giving grammatical cues or other cues to the correct answer. Finally, avoid using statements taken directly from the lesson plan or curriculum. The goal of many courses and lessons, as reflected in the learning objectives, is to teach students to perform skills needed on the job. Therefore, performance testing will constitute a significant portion of the testing for many lessons. Objectives that require the demonstration of observable skills are tested by performance tests. Performance tests include the following considerations. First, performance tests are simulated work situations in which students demonstrate their ability to complete procedures. Evaluation of performance usually involves a detailed observation and critique of a student's performance by a trained evaluator or instructor. The evaluation is supported by checklists or some kind of rating system. The performance is observed and evaluated under the conditions and standards set forth in the learning objective. Skill objectives to be performance tested are identified and rated as to their relative importance in measuring student attainment of the related job skills. Development of performance tests can be very involved. Performance tests consist of a simulated work situation in which students perform tasks based on skill objectives. These type of tests are usually performed when a student is shadowing on the floor. As an instructor, you will be administering tests at specific points during training in the classroom environment in order to assess learning retention. There are three main types of tests. Pre-tests measure a learner's entry-level behaviors and prior knowledge of selected instructional objectives. They are usually given before the learner has received instruction. Embedded tests measure selected instructional objectives. They are usually given while the learner is engaged in the instruction and throughout the lesson. Post-tests measure all instructional objectives. They are usually given after the learner has received instruction. Each type of test should match the performance standard and conditions specified in the objective. They provide learners with the opportunity to show their achievement of the objective by meeting specified knowledge or skill performance criteria. Instructors must carry out a variety of responsibilities regarding testing. There are 5 primary duties as an instructor when it comes to testing. First, prepare the environment in which learners will be assessed. This is very important. Some things that you should look for. Secure a time and place for the assessment. If you are in a classroom, make sure the classroom is clean and neat. Remove or limit any environmental distractors such as noise. If the assessment is taken online, make sure the exam is accessible to the learner. Make sure that you have the tools necessary to perform the assessment. For example, phone, computer terminals, etc. This means ensuring that the tools to be used are in working order and that there is sufficient quantity for all participants. Always prepare for possible technical difficulties by having additional resources available to resolve those technical difficulties. You will want to make sure your learners are aware of several protocols before they begin any assessment. First, location. Where is the assessment going to take place? Second, timing. The amount of time the participant has to complete the assessment. Then finally, scoring. Indicate any scoring procedures. As an instructor, you will administer the testing by asking questions before, during, and after the test. After completing any testing, make sure you review the correct answers with participants, correct any misconceptions, and review any material as necessary. Assessing a student's mastery of objectives in a knowledge test or skill acquisition in a performance test is a natural progression in the learning process. For the assessment to be accurate, test items should be directly related to the level of learning you want to measure. Remember, assessment is an integral part of the teaching and learning process and as such should enhance effective learning and contribute to the improvement of teaching. Instructors have many responsibilities when executing assessments, so it is imperative that the instructor understands the complexities of testing in a questioning format during lesson instruction. In this training session, we discussed the role of testing during a lesson and covered how to assess learner performance. We explained how to provide effective feedback and how to develop effective questions for testing purposes. In our final session of the ASU Help Center Certified Trainer program, we will discuss instructor and student evaluation.